My son got shot, right in front of me, while we were burying my mother. But the woman who did it had no idea who she was messing with. I'm the deputy commissioner. Pause for dramatic effect. 3 months ago, I thought I had everything under control. 25 years in law enforcement, climbing from a beat cop to deputy commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Department. I'd seen every kind of criminal, dealt with every type of crisis, and earned the respect of thousands of officers under my command. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on the darkest day of my life. It was supposed to be a day of mourning, of saying goodbye to the woman who raised me to believe in justice, who taught me that every person deserves dignity and respect. My mother, Eleanor Rodriguez, had passed away after a courageous battle with cancer. She was 78 years old, a retired school teacher who had touched hundreds of lives in our small community of Riverside Heights. The morning of her funeral, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting my dress uniform. The same uniform my mother had been so proud of when I first earned my badge. The same uniform she'd seen me wear to countless award ceremonies, promotions, and community events. I never imagined I'd be wearing it to her funeral, and I certainly never imagined it would be stained with my son's blood before the day was over. You see, there are moments in life that test everything you believe in. Moments that strip away your titles, your authority, your carefully constructed identity, and leave you face to face with who you really are. This is the story of one such moment. This is the story of how a neighborhood HOA Karen turned my mother's funeral into a nightmare, shot my innocent son, and discovered too late that some people you just don't mess with. But more importantly, this is a story about justice, about standing up for what's right, and about how sometimes the very system you've dedicated your life to serving becomes the tool through which righteousness prevails. So buckle up, because what happened next will restore your faith in karma, justice, and the power of never underestimating the quiet strength of those around you. Let me take you back to where it all began. Riverside Heights isn't your typical suburban neighborhood. It's one of those places where the houses are perfectly manicured, the sidewalks are spotless, and the homeowners association rules are thicker than most legal documents. My mother had lived there for 37 years. She'd bought the house right after my father died in the line of duty when I was just 12 years old. It was supposed to be a fresh start for us, a place where she could raise me away from the violence that had claimed my father's life. Eleanor Rodriguez was the kind of woman who baked cookies for new neighbors, organized block parties, and never missed a chance to help someone in need. Everyone loved her, everyone except Margaret Thompson, the HOA president who had made my mother's final years a living hell. You know the type, mid-50s, perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and an attitude that could freeze hell over. Margaret Thompson had been the HOA president for 8 years, ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist disguised in Chanel perfume. For the past 2 years, she'd been targeting my mother with frivolous violations. The grass was 2 inches too tall. The mailbox needed repainting. The garden gnome was aesthetically inappropriate. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine was Margaret's way of trying to force my mother out of the neighborhood. But my mother was tougher than Margaret ever imagined. Eleanor Rodriguez had raised a police officer while working 2 jobs and putting herself through night school to get her teaching degree. She wasn't about to be intimidated by some entitled woman with too much time and too little empathy. Mijo, she'd tell me during our Sunday phone calls, that woman thinks she can bully me because I'm old and alone. But she doesn't know who raised you. She doesn't know the strength that runs in our blood. I'd offered to handle Margaret Thompson through official channels dozens of times, but my mother always refused. Handle your own battles with honor, she'd say. That's what your father would have wanted. Looking back now, I wish I'd insisted. I wish I'd used my position to investigate Thompson's harassment campaign. I wish I'd done something, anything, to protect my mother from what was coming. But life doesn't come with crystal balls, and hindsight is a luxury we only get after the damage is done. The morning of my mother's funeral dawned gray and miserable. The weather seemed to understand what we were going through, low-hanging clouds, intermittent drizzle, and that particular kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. I picked up my son Marcus from his apartment. Marcus was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in social work and dreams of changing the world. He had his grandmother's heart and his grandfather's sense of justice. Looking at him that morning, dressed in his first real suit, I saw 3 generations of my family's commitment to serving others. "Dad," he said as we drove to Eternal Rest Cemetery, "I keep expecting Grandma to call and ask if we're bringing her favorite flowers." I smiled despite the pain. She's probably watching us right now, making sure we don't mess up her final party. The service was beautiful. Father Martinez spoke about my mother's dedication to education, her volunteer work at the homeless shelter, and her unwavering faith. My colleagues from the department attended in full dress uniform, a sea of blue showing respect for one of their own. The mayor was there, along with 3 school principals and at least 50 of my mother's former students. But as we prepared to leave for the cemetery, I noticed Margaret Thompson standing at the back of the church. She wasn't there to pay respects, the sneer on her face made that clear. She was there to gloat, to make sure the woman who had defied her was really gone. I should have known then that the day was far from over. Eternal Rest Cemetery sits on 15 acres of rolling hills overlooking the valley. My mother had chosen her plot months before she died, a peaceful spot under an old oak tree where she could watch the sunrise and keep an eye on everyone, as she put it. The graveside service was intimate, just family and close friends. Marcus stood beside me, occasionally wiping away tears as Father Martinez offered final prayers. My ex-wife Sarah was there with her new husband, our past differences set aside for this moment of shared grief. As the service concluded and people began to disperse, I noticed Marcus walking toward the parking area. He was probably going to get the flowers we'd left in the car, white roses, my mother's favorites. That's when I saw her. Margaret Thompson was marching across the cemetery grounds like she owned the place, her heels clicking against the stone pathways with military precision. She was heading straight for Marcus, and something about her posture, her expression, told me this wasn't going to be a polite condolence. I started walking in their direction, that cop instinct kicking in, the one that can sense trouble from 100 yards away. "Excuse me," I heard Thompson's voice carry across the quiet cemetery. "You're parked illegally." Marcus turned around, confused. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your vehicle is parked in a reserved spot. This is private property, and there are rules about where visitors can park." I picked up my pace. This woman was actually harassing my son at his grandmother's funeral over a parking spot. "Ma'am," Marcus said politely, "I'm just here for my grandmother's service." The funeral director told us where to park. "I don't care what anyone told you," Thompson snapped. "I'm the president of the Riverside Heights HOA, and I have jurisdiction over cemetery parking violations in this district." That was completely false, by the way. HOA authority doesn't extend to cemetery grounds. But Margaret Thompson had been lying about her authority for so long, I don't think she remembered what was real anymore. I was 20 feet away when things escalated. "You people think you can park anywhere, ignore any rule, disrespect any authority," Thompson continued, her voice rising. "Well, not on my watch." "Ma'am, please," Marcus said, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Today is really hard for our family. Can we please don't you dare tell me what to do." And that's when Margaret Thompson reached into her purse and pulled out a gun. Time does funny things in moments of crisis. Sometimes it crawls like molasses, every second stretching into an eternity. Other times it moves so fast you can't process what's happening until it's over. This was both. I saw the gun come out of Thompson's purse in slow motion, a small silver revolver that caught the gray light filtering through the clouds. I saw Marcus's eyes widen in shock and terror. I saw other mourners turning to look, their faces transforming from grief to horror. But my body moved at lightning speed. 25 years of training kicked in. I was running before my conscious mind even registered the threat. "Police! Drop the weapon. My voice carried across the cemetery with the authority of 2.5 decades of law enforcement. Several mourners dove for cover behind headstones. Father Martinez grabbed an elderly woman and pulled her down. But Margaret Thompson didn't drop the gun. Instead, she turned toward me with wild eyes and an expression I'd seen too many times in my career, the look of someone who's gone too far to back down. "You don't tell me what to do," she screamed. "None of you tell me what to do anymore." She swung the gun back toward Marcus, who was frozen in place, probably too shocked to move. And then she fired. The sound of gunshot in an open space is different from what you hear in movies. It's sharper, more violent, more final. It echoes off headstones and trees and seems to hang in the air forever. Marcus went down. My son, my only child, the young man who wanted to dedicate his life to helping others, crumpled to the ground with blood spreading across his chest. In that moment, everything I was, deputy commissioner, law enforcement officer, respected member of the community, evaporated. I was just a father watching his child get shot by a madwoman at his grandmother's funeral. But that's also when Margaret Thompson made her fatal error. She turned the gun on me. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Thompson yelled, the gun shaking in her hands. "You think your badges and your uniforms make you better than everyone else?" I had my service weapon drawn now, trained on her center mass. Standard procedure in an active shooter situation. But there was nothing standard about this. "Drop the weapon now," I commanded, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. "This is Deputy Commissioner Rodriguez of the Metropolitan Police Department. You are under arrest." For the first time since this nightmare began, Margaret Thompson hesitated. The title registered, and I saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even fear. "You're lying," she said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. "Ma'am, I am Deputy Commissioner of Metro Police. I have 300 officers under my direct command. I oversee criminal investigations for the entire metropolitan area. And you just shot my son at my mother's funeral." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. I could see Thompson's mind racing, trying to process what she'd just learned. The woman who had spent years harassing an elderly teacher had just committed assault with a deadly weapon against the son of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the state. At her mother's funeral. In front of dozens of witnesses. Including half the police brass in the city. "Drop your weapon and get on the ground," I repeated. "Now." This time, she complied. The next few hours were a blur of sirens, paramedics, crime scene tape, and the controlled chaos that follows any shooting incident. Marcus was rushed to Metropolitan General Hospital, where the trauma team worked for 3 hours to remove the bullet from his chest. It had missed his heart by 2 inches, 2 inches between life and death, between having my son graduate from college or burying him next to his grandmother. Margaret Thompson was arrested on charges of assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, discharging a firearm in a public place, and about 6 other felonies that would ensure she spent the next decade in prison. But here's what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known when she decided to terrorize my family on the worst day of our lives. I wasn't just Deputy Commissioner Rodriguez. I was Deputy Commissioner Rodriguez, whose best friend was the district attorney. Whose former partner was now chief of detectives. Whose reputation in the law enforcement community was built on 25 years of putting violent criminals exactly where they belonged. Within 48 hours, every detail of Margaret Thompson's life was under microscopic examination. Financial records, tax returns, HOA management practices. Personal correspondence, everything. And what we found was beautiful, poetic justice. You know how sometimes you investigate someone expecting to find minor infractions, and instead you uncover a criminal enterprise? That's exactly what happened with Margaret Thompson. It turns out our HOA president had been running quite the operation. Over the past 5 years, she'd embezzled nearly $200,000 from HOA fees. She'd been creating fake violations to justify excessive fines, then pocketing the money instead of using it for neighborhood improvements. She'd also been taking kickbacks from contractors, approving unnecessary projects at inflated prices, and splitting the profits. The community pool that supposedly cost $50,000 to renovate. She'd paid her brother-in-law $15,000 and kept the rest. But the most damning evidence was her harassment campaign against my mother and 3 other elderly residents. We found emails, text messages, and recorded phone calls proving she'd been systematically targeting older homeowners, trying to force them to sell so her real estate investor friends could buy their properties at below-market prices. My mother wasn't just a random victim. She was part of a deliberate scheme to gentrify the neighborhood by driving out long-term residents who couldn't afford to fight back. Except Margaret Thompson had picked the wrong family to mess with. The trial was a masterpiece of justice served cold. The district attorney assigned his best prosecutor to the case, partly because of our friendship, but mostly because the evidence was so overwhelming that conviction was guaranteed. Margaret Thompson's defense attorney tried every angle. Temporary insanity. Emotional distress. Self-defense, which was laughable given that she'd approached Marcus, not the other way around. Nothing worked. The jury took exactly 47 minutes to return guilty verdicts on all charges. Assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. Embezzlement, guilty. Fraud, guilty. Racketeering, guilty. The judge, a woman who'd worked her way up from public defender to superior court, looked at Thompson with the kind of disgust usually reserved for child abusers and terrorists. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated pattern of abuse directed at vulnerable members of our community. You used your position to terrorize elderly residents, steal from your neighbors, and ultimately committed a violent crime that could have killed an innocent young man." She paused, letting the words sink in. "The court sentences you to 15 years in state prison, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. You will make full restitution to all victims of your embezzlement scheme, including the Rodriguez family for medical expenses and emotional distress." Margaret Thompson broke down crying at the defense table. The woman who had terrorized my mother for 2 years, who had shot my son at a funeral, who had ruled her little kingdom with cruelty and greed, was reduced to sobbing pleas for mercy. But mercy was something she'd never shown my mother. And mercy was something I was fresh out of. Marcus recovered fully, though the scar on his chest serves as a permanent reminder of that terrible day. But you know what? Instead of making him bitter or afraid, the experience strengthened his resolve to help others. He's now a victim's advocate, working with families who've experienced violent crime. He says getting shot taught him something about resilience that no textbook ever could. "Dad," he told me 6 months after the trial, "Grandma always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe this happened so I could understand what victims really go through." That's my son, finding purpose in trauma, strength in suffering. His grandmother would be proud. The neighborhood of Riverside Heights underwent its own healing process. With Thompson's criminal enterprise exposed, the HOA was dissolved and reformed with actual oversight and accountability. The stolen money was recovered and used to fund community improvements my mother had always advocated for: a new playground, better lighting, and a community garden where neighbors could grow flowers and vegetables together. A memorial bench was installed under the oak tree where my mother is buried, with a plaque that reads, "Eleanor Rodriguez, teacher, mother, friend." She taught us that kindness is strength and justice is love in action. This story isn't really about revenge, though I won't lie, seeing Margaret Thompson led away in handcuffs was deeply satisfying. It's about something more fundamental, the idea that actions have consequences, that bullies eventually meet their match, and that sometimes the universe has a sense of justice that's more perfect than anything we could plan. My mother spent her final years being harassed by a woman who thought power came from intimidation and fear. But real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that matters, comes from integrity, service, and standing up for what's right. Margaret Thompson thought she was untouchable because she'd never faced real consequences for her actions. She'd bullied elderly residents and stolen from her neighbors for years without anyone fighting back effectively. She'd grown so accustomed to getting away with abuse that she felt invincible. But here's what bullies never understand: there's always someone stronger. There's always someone with more authority, more resources, more determination to see justice done. And sometimes, that someone is the quiet elderly teacher's son who happens to be the deputy commissioner of police. Thompson's mistake wasn't just shooting my son, though that was unforgivable. Her mistake was assuming that the people she victimized were powerless, that their families wouldn't fight back, that her little kingdom would never be challenged by the real world. She forgot that behind every vulnerable person is someone who loves them. And sometimes, that someone has the power to bring entire criminal enterprises crashing down. The Thompson case became a model for how law enforcement agencies across the country investigate HOA corruption. What started as a personal tragedy exposed a pattern of elder abuse and financial fraud that was happening in communities everywhere. I've spoken at conferences about the case, not as the deputy commissioner who got revenge on his family's tormentor, but as someone who learned that our most vulnerable citizens often need protection from the very people who claim to serve them. HOA boards, local government officials, anyone in a position of power over others, they all need oversight. They all need accountability. Because power without accountability is just tyranny with better paperwork. My mother always said that teaching was about more than education, it was about showing young people how to be decent human beings. In her final years, she was still teaching, still showing the world what dignity looked like in the face of cruelty. Margaret Thompson thought she could break my mother's spirit with endless harassment and petty tyranny. Instead, she only revealed the strength that had carried our family through decades of challenges. And in the end, that strength reached out from beyond the grave to ensure justice was served. It's been 3 years since that terrible day at Eternal Rest Cemetery. 3 years since I watched my son get shot at his grandmother's funeral. 3 years since Margaret Thompson learned the hardest lesson of her life about the consequences of evil actions. Marcus graduated from his master's program in victim advocacy and now runs a non-profit organization that helps families navigate the criminal justice system. He speaks at schools and community centers about conflict resolution and standing up to bullies, not with violence, but with courage, integrity, and the support of people who refuse to let evil triumph. I retired from the police department last year, after 30 years of service. My final case was helping to establish new protocols for investigating elder abuse in residential communities. It's not the legacy I planned, but it's the one my mother would have wanted. The house in Riverside Heights sold 6 months after the trial. The new owners are a young family with 3 kids who love the community garden and regularly leave flowers on my mother's memorial bench. They never knew Eleanor Rodriguez, but they benefit every day from the changes her struggle brought about. Margaret Thompson is currently serving her sentence at Riverside Women's Correctional Facility. She's eligible for parole in 12 years, assuming good behavior. I don't think about her much anymore, except when other families contact me about similar situations in their neighborhoods. Because that's the real lesson here, this story isn't unique. Somewhere right now, there's an elderly person being harassed by someone with a little power and a lot of cruelty. Somewhere, there's a family wondering if they should fight back or just try to endure. If you're that family, let me tell you what my mother taught me: never underestimate the power of doing what's right. Never assume that bullies are stronger than they appear. And never forget that behind every quiet victim might be someone with the resources and determination to bring justice crashing down on those who abuse the innocent. Standing in that cemetery 3 years ago, watching paramedics work on my son while Margaret Thompson sat in handcuffs, I thought the story was about revenge. I thought it was about a powerful man using his position to destroy someone who had hurt his family. But I was wrong. The real story is about my mother's legacy. Eleanor Rodriguez spent 37 years in Riverside Heights showing her neighbors what kindness looked like. She volunteered at schools, helped elderly residents with their groceries, and never missed a chance to make someone's day brighter. When Margaret Thompson started her harassment campaign, my mother could have moved away. She could have paid the illegal fines and avoided the conflict. She could have asked me to intervene using my official position. Instead, she chose to stay and fight, not just for herself, but for every other resident who was being victimized by Thompson's schemes. She chose to be an example of dignity in the face of cruelty, strength in the face of intimidation. Her death wasn't the end of that fight, it was the beginning of justice. Margaret Thompson thought she was attacking a powerless old woman with no one to protect her. What she was really doing was declaring war on a family that had spent generations serving others, protecting the innocent, and standing up for what's right. She brought a gun to a gunfight, but she forgot to check who she was fighting. Today, Riverside Heights is the community my mother always dreamed it could be, a place where neighbors look out for each other, where the vulnerable are protected, and where bullies learn that their actions have consequences. That's Eleanor Rodriguez's true monument. Not the bench under the oak tree, not the memorial plaque, but a neighborhood transformed from a place of fear into a place of hope. And every family that's protected from the next HOA tyrant, every elderly resident who can live in peace, every community that learns the lessons of accountability and justice, that's my mother's legacy continuing to grow. Margaret Thompson thought she could silence one teacher's voice. Instead, she amplified it forever. Remember, behind every person you meet might be someone with the power to change your life forever. Choose kindness. Choose justice. Choose to be the person who makes the world better, not worse. Because you never know who's watching. And you never know who they know. In memory of all the Eleanor Rodriguezes of the world, the quiet heroes who stand up to bullies so the rest of us don't have to.